Andrew Reid's first week in his new home ended with a knock that shattered the illusion of peace. The woman on his porch didn't introduce herself. She issued a demand. "You need to leave." Her voice dripped with decades of unchallenged authority. As a former cop, Andrew recognized trouble, but even he couldn't predict how far she'd go to steal his home, or how violently their war would explode. Andrew had barely finished unpacking the last of his boxes when he heard that sharp, insistent knocking at his front door. The rhythmic pounding had a commanding quality, as though whoever stood outside believed they had every right to walk in uninvited. He exhaled a slow breath, setting down a framed photo of his late father, a man who had also served in law enforcement, inspiring Andrew to follow in his footsteps. Already, Andrew suspected this wouldn't be the warm welcome he'd hoped for in his new suburban refuge. He had moved here a week ago, seeking peace and a clean slate after years of high-stress police work. But it seemed trouble had a way of finding him. Opening the door, he was met by a middle-aged woman standing stiffly on his porch. Her arms were crossed, and her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She looked every bit like someone who believed her authority was absolute. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, and an air of self-importance that practically radiated off her. Her short platinum blonde hair was cut into a severe bob, and her blouse was impeccably pressed into beige slacks. She exuded the practiced polish of someone who spent her days policing the neighborhood. "You need to leave," she said immediately. There was no greeting, no introduction, just a demand that dripped with entitlement. Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She let out an exaggerated sigh, as though addressing a dim-witted child. "This house isn't yours. I don't know who you think you are, but this property has already been spoken for." Andrew stifled the urge to laugh at the absurdity. He sized her up calmly, reminding himself he no longer wore the badge every single day, though he still carried it in his pocket. "Spoken for?" he repeated. "Strange, because the mortgage and title deeds say otherwise." Her eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. My son is supposed to move in next month. We were promised this house." Andrew leaned against the door frame. "According to my deed, it's mine. Who promised you a house you don't own?" The woman's nostrils flared. "Me. I oversee the homeowner association in this neighborhood. I approve who gets to live here and who doesn't. There must have been a mistake with the sale, because this house was never supposed to go on the market." Andrew had seen enough brazen threats in his day, but this one nearly made him laugh out loud. "Well," he said, "I'm not part of any homeowner association, and last I checked, they don't have the authority to invalidate a perfectly legal purchase." Her expression tightened into a mask of frustration. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice as though to reason with him. "My son has been waiting for this house for months. This is a tight-knit community. We like to keep things orderly, and it would be best if you—" He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Let me stop you right there. I don't care who your son is. I bought this house, fair and square. Unless you have a real legal argument, which I doubt, this conversation is over." The woman's face darkened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she hissed. Andrew chuckled softly. "Lady, I've dealt with murderers, gang members, career criminals, you name it. I think I'll survive a pushy neighbor." Her cheeks flushed with rage. "I'll have you removed," she snapped. "You'll regret this." He shrugged, refusing to be ruffled by her threats, looking forward to it. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed away, muttering under her breath. As Andrew watched her retreat, he couldn't help shaking his head. A handful of times in his career, he'd seen that brand of entitlement. Someone so sure of their own importance, they believed the law should bend to accommodate them. Little did he know, this was just the opening shot of a much larger war. Early the next morning, Andrew stepped onto his front porch with a hot cup of coffee, hoping to enjoy the crisp air and a moment of quiet. He still felt the lingering weight of his old job, the endless nights, the high stakes, the fractured sleep. This move was supposed to help him breathe again. However, trouble resurfaced in the form of a large white envelope lying on his doorstep. Bold red letters declared it an urgent notice. Frowning, he set his coffee mug on the railing and ripped open the envelope. It wasn't even addressed to him personally, just current occupant, as though he were a transient, squatting on property that wasn't his. The letter, printed on faux official homeowner association stationery, demanded he vacate the property within 7 days due to illegal occupancy. It cited a clerical error and threatened legal action if he did not comply. Skimming to the bottom of the page, he read the signature, Karen Mitchell, Homeowner Association President. He exhaled sharply, half amusement, half annoyance. She's really trying this, he muttered. If he knew anything about real estate law, and he knew a fair amount, this was nonsense. The house wasn't under any such association. The notion of a forced eviction was laughable. This was classic intimidation, nothing more. Andrew crumpled the letter and tossed it into the garbage bin near his porch, his mind drifting briefly to the more dangerous threats he'd faced in his years on the force. A bogus eviction notice from a self-proclaimed neighborhood tyrant wasn't even in the same league. He had just stepped back inside, intending to finish his coffee in peace, when the knocking started again. This time, louder and more insistent. He sighed, already guessing who stood behind the door. Sure enough, Karen Mitchell was there, arms crossed, her expression twisted with righteous fury. "Good morning, Karen," Andrew said, leaning against the doorframe. "I just got your letter. Really cute stuff, but I'm afraid I won't be going anywhere." Her lips thinned. "This is no joke, Mr. Reid. You're trespassing on community property. If you don't vacate voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to escalate legally." He lifted an eyebrow. "Oh, and how do you plan to do that?" "I've already spoken with my attorney," she declared, chin lifting proudly. "I have proof this house was never meant to be sold to an outsider. Your purchase is invalid." Andrew couldn't resist a short laugh. "Karen, I don't think you understand real estate law. I bought this house legally. The sale is final. I don't require your personal blessing or that of any so-called association." Her face darkened. "This is a private community. We have rules, Mr. Reid, and I won't let some outsider destroy our neighborhood's integrity." "You don't own this neighborhood, Karen," he said coolly. She drew herself up. "I've lived here 20 years. I've personally approved every single homeowner on this street, and I'm not about to let you take over the house I set aside for my son." "Set aside," Andrew repeated, his amusement fading. "So that's the crux of all this. You wanted the house for your son and assumed you had a claim to it." She bristled. "I will make your life hell," she spat. "I'll file complaints. I'll have you fined for every single violation, your lawn, your mailbox, your fence. I'll bury you in so many fees you'll beg to leave." Andrew's smirk returned, tempered by years of dealing with far worse hostility. "Karen, you should really do your homework before pulling this stunt. I've been in real firefights. You filing petty complaints doesn't even register on my scale." Her fists clenched. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." He took a slow sip of the coffee he still held, letting the silence weigh on her. "We'll see about that." Glowering, she spun on her heel, heels clicking furiously on his driveway, and stormed off. Andrew watched until she vanished around the corner, then closed the door with a heavy sigh. He suspected the show was only beginning. That evening, while stepping out onto his porch, he noticed a small group of people gathered across the street in front of Karen Mitchell's house. Low voices carried on the breeze, punctuated by an occasional shout. Andrew had seen enough neighborhood disputes to recognize a potential escalation when he heard one. Karen's threats that morning were a hint of what she might do: turn the neighborhood against him, turn up the pressure in every way possible until he had no choice but to leave. He sipped his coffee slowly, leaning against the porch railing, watching as she spoke animatedly to the growing crowd. It reminded him of the old mob mentalities he'd encountered during his police career. People riled up by a single manipulative voice. They didn't always need facts, they just needed a scapegoat. Andrew guessed that in her version of events, he was the villain who had stolen her son's house. Within minutes, the crowd began marching across the street. Karen led them with a smug, triumphant expression. Some neighbors looked hesitant, but they followed nonetheless. Andrew set his mug down and crossed his arms, refusing to be intimidated by a band of suburbanites chanting Karen's narrative. "Mr. Reid," Karen said sharply, stopping at the bottom of his steps. "We need to talk." He raised an eyebrow. "We, or just you?" Her smirk widened. "We, as in the community, the people who actually belong here." Andrew cast a glance at the neighbors behind her, some faces he recognized from quick nods or half-smiles since he'd moved in, others complete strangers. Most wore uncertain expressions, shifting from foot to foot. They'd obviously been fed a story, but they weren't entirely convinced. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to exist in my own home," Andrew said dryly. "You stole this house, Mr. Reid," Karen declared. "You know it, and everyone here knows it." He let out a short laugh. "That's interesting. I distinctly remember buying it." Her smile flickered, then returned. "You're an outsider. This isn't your place. We've decided you need to leave." She gestured to the people behind her, as if they were all in unanimous agreement. Andrew tilted his head. "You've decided. That's cute, but last I checked, you can't seize someone's property because you happen to want it." That caught a few neighbors off guard. Andrew noticed the flicker of doubt in their eyes. Karen's jaw tightened. "You're making this difficult." He stared at her, unimpressed. "Karen, you showed up on my property with a small mob expecting me to surrender the keys. Don't be ridiculous." She tried a sweet tone that barely masked her hostility. "We're giving you a chance to do the right thing before this gets ugly." Andrew narrowed his eyes. There was something about her voice, calm but laced with menace. "I don't respond well to threats." "That wasn't a threat," Karen said, her tone dripping with false warmth. "It was a warning." He could feel the tension in the air, almost tangible. The neighbors hovered behind her, clearly unsure how far this would go. Some looked ready to back off, but Karen wasn't giving them a way out. Then, without warning, something in her snapped. She lunged forward and slapped him across the face, hard enough that the sound echoed along the quiet street. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One woman clapped a hand over her mouth while a man muttered, "What the?" For Andrew, the sting lingered, but his grin was ice. 20 years ago, this might have made him flinch. Now? It just proved how desperate she'd become. Slowly, he turned his head to face her again. Karen's face burned red with anger. She had expected a sharper reaction from him, maybe shouting, or at least some flinch of pain. Instead, she saw only a cold, measured calm. "Assaulting an officer," he said quietly. "Karen, that's a bold move." Her eyes went wide. What?" Andrew reached into his pocket and pulled out his old badge. He wasn't officially on duty these days, but that piece of metal still represented his years of service. In a single heartbeat, the dynamic changed. The smugness drained from Karen's face as she realized she had just hit a former, or possibly still active law enforcement officer. The neighbors, too, looked stricken, as though they'd just awakened to the fact that Karen had led them into something far more serious than a neighborhood spat. He let the silence stretch, letting her squirm in the heavy quiet. "You didn't think to check who I was before you pulled this stunt?" he asked. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Andrew drew a slow breath. "Let me explain your options. Right now, I could arrest you for assaulting a cop. That alone is enough." Karen went ghost pale. I'm also a reasonable man," he continued, "so I'll give you a choice. Either you and your friends turn around and go home like this never happened, or I put you in handcuffs right here on your lawn." A tense hush fell over the group. Andrew could practically see their panic. A tall man in the back cleared his throat. I think this has gone far enough," he mumbled. Others hurriedly nodded in agreement. Even those who had seemed eager a moment before were now retreating, clearly wanting no part of an arrest. Karen turned on them, betrayal flickering in her eyes. "You're all just going to let him stay here? After everything I said?" A young woman near the back shook her head. "Yeah, we are. Because unlike you, we don't want to be arrested." Karen's face twitched in fury, but her fight had nowhere to go. Andrew stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I meant what I said. This ends now. Else, I promise you'll regret it." She opened her mouth to retort, but no sound emerged. One by one, the neighbors slipped away, until Karen stood alone in the street, trembling with rage. Finally, she turned and stormed off, the embers of her anger all too visible. Andrew picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. He wasn't naive enough to believe she'd just give up. People like Karen, entitled, manipulative, power-hungry, rarely walked away from a fight they started. This felt like a calm before the storm. Sure enough, he found out how relentless she could be when she woke him at 6 the next morning with furious pounding on his door. Andrew dragged himself out of bed, irritation mounting with each step. He hadn't even had time to throw on more than a t-shirt when the banging resumed. When he pulled the door open, he was greeted by 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies standing stiffly on his porch. Both wore practiced neutral expressions. Behind them, lips curled in a triumphant grin, stood Karen Mitchell. "Morning, gentlemen," Andrew said. "Something I can help you with?" One of the deputies, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache, cleared his throat. "Sir, we've received a report that you're illegally occupying this residence." Andrew blinked. "Illegally occupying? Interesting." He paused, then pointed to Karen. "And who exactly made this report?" Karen stepped forward, practically pushing between the deputies. "I did. This man is trespassing. He has no legal right to be here, and I want him removed." Exhaling a tired breath, Andrew rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Karen, we've been over this." The mustached deputy raised a hand, signaling Andrew to hold off. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership?" Andrew didn't miss the officer's lack of enthusiasm. They seemed to recognize a likely false complaint but had to follow procedure. Meanwhile, Karen looked positively gleeful. as though she believed victory was in sight. Without a word, sighed, returning a minute later with his property deed, purchase contract, and mortgage documents. He handed them over. The mustached deputy studied each page, brows furrowing deeper the longer he read. The younger deputy leaned over to scan the documents as well. After a solid minute, the older deputy let out a low sigh and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, these documents are legitimate. Mr. Reid is the legal owner of this property." Karen's smile twitched. "No, that can't be right. He was never approved by the homeowner association. The purchase was a mistake." "Ma'am," the deputy interrupted, "an association has zero authority over private home sales unless there's a contractual agreement in place. According to these records, the property was never part of any homeowner association to begin with." Karen's features twisted in frustration. "But he doesn't belong here." The younger officer arched an eyebrow. "Are you seriously trying to have a homeowner arrested for living in his own house?" Her mouth opened and closed, but words failed her. She'd evidently counted on the sheriff's department to haul Andrew away in cuffs. Instead, she was the one floundering. The mustached deputy turned to Andrew, an apologetic glimmer in his eyes. "Mr. Reid, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. You're clearly within your rights." He handed back the documents. Andrew took them with a slight nod. "No problem, deputy. I had a feeling this was coming." He turned back to Karen. "Ma'am," the deputy said, "I strongly advise you to stop making false reports. If you file another fraudulent complaint, you could be charged." Karen's face drained of color. Andrew added, with deliberate mock thoughtfulness, "Also, I could press charges for harassment. I let the slap slide, but calling the cops on me? That's strike two." She stepped back, eyes wide. "You wouldn't." He shrugged. "Try me." The younger deputy had to hide a smirk. "Anything else?" But Karen was already backing away, face twisted in fury and embarrassment. She turned and practically ran back to her house, arms rigid at her sides. After the deputies left, Andrew closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a half-chuckle. Karen was getting desperate. She'd tried intimidation, a mob scene, and the police, all to no avail. Yet he had the sense this wouldn't be the end of her scheming. The next morning, a new problem arose. Andrew woke to find his water shut off. His first assumption was that there might be city maintenance, so he quickly checked for any notice from the utility company. Instead, taped to his front door was a bright red paper, "Notice of utility termination due to non-compliance with community regulations. The homeowner of this residence is deemed ineligible for continued water service. Please contact the homeowner association for resolution." Andrew stared at it for a solid minute, torn between anger and disbelief. "She really cut off my water," he muttered, shaking. Karen had gone from petty harassment to outright criminal interference. He called the local water utility company, sitting through a tedious on-hold loop, until finally a representative answered. "My water's off," he explained. "There's a notice here claiming the homeowner association shut it off. Pretty sure that's illegal." The operator sounded baffled. "Sir, your account is current. We don't allow any association to interfere with service on private property. I'll dispatch someone immediately to restore your water. If you like, I can also forward this incident to our legal department." "That would be great," Andrew said dryly. Less than an hour later, a city utility worker arrived and flipped his water back on with no problem. Andrew thanked him, then wasted no time filing a complaint with the city's public works department. Karen had crossed a line. By tampering with city utilities, she'd taken an action that carried genuine legal consequences. He also reported her to the state housing authority for harassment. If she wanted to play high-stakes games, he'd show her what happened when the law pushed back. As he slipped the paperwork into the mailbox, he found himself glancing across the street at Karen's house. Andrew eyed Karen's property. Cutting his water was bold, reckless, and the perfect mistake to end her game, if he played it right. That evening, just as Andrew was settling down for a quiet night, he heard a noise outside. Peering through the window, he spotted a tow truck backing into his driveway. A jolt of confusion hit him. He hadn't requested a tow. Stepping out to investigate, he discovered Karen standing there with her arms folded and a self-satisfied smirk on her face. "Remove the vehicle," she ordered the tow truck driver. "Now." The driver hesitated, glancing from her to Andrew. "Ma'am, you said this was an unauthorized vehicle?" "It is unauthorized," Karen snapped. "He's violating homeowner association parking regulations." Andrew pinched the bridge of his nose. "Karen, I am not in your homeowner association. You have zero authority over my driveway." She crossed her arms more tightly. All properties in this neighborhood are subject to association oversight. Andrew sighed, pulling out his phone. I've had enough of this. Karen snorted derisively. Go ahead, call whoever you want. The board has already approved. He held up his phone so she could see he was dialing. Hey Mike, he said into the receiver. I've got a situation at my place. The same woman who made that false police report is trying to tow my car right out of my driveway. A pause. Then Andrew smiled. Great, see you in 5. Karen's smugness vanished. Who's Mike? Andrew slid his phone into his pocket, grin widening. Sheriff Mike Grayson. The same deputy you wasted time with on a fraudulent trespassing claim. She blanched. The tow truck driver, looking increasingly uncomfortable, ventured, Ma'am, do you have a court order to tow this vehicle? Because if not, this could be considered theft. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of support. None of the neighbors had come this time. She'd alienated them all. Then the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night, and a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Out stepped Mike Grayson, his expression grim. Ma'am, he said, turning to Karen, explain why you're trying to tow this man's car from his own driveway. Karen's mouth opened, but no reply formed. Andrew folded his arms, enjoying the spectacle. Finally, Mike turned to the tow truck driver. Sir, there's no legal basis for this tow. You're free to leave. The driver wasted no time in returning to his truck and driving away. The sheriff then faced Karen fully. Ma'am, this is your second time making a false claim against Mr. Reid. We've also been notified you interfered with city utilities. Karen's eyes widened. I was just enforcing. Karen Mitchell, he said. You're under arrest for filing a false police report, attempted vehicle theft, and tampering with city property. She stumbled back. Wait, this isn't fair. He's the outsider. He doesn't belong here. Andrew crossed his arms. Funny. The law disagrees. As the deputies clamped handcuffs around her wrists, Karen shrieked, You'll regret this. You'll all regret this. She kicked and spat insults, but none of it mattered. They bundled her into the back of the cruiser and the door slammed shut. In the days that followed, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. An official investigation was launched into Karen's activities. It turned out she had no real legal standing as an HOA president. She'd been fabricating rules and scamming homeowners for years, collecting fees, dictating who could buy and sell, and ruling through fear. With her arrest, the empire she'd built through intimidation collapsed. Andrew stayed right where he was, and neighbors who'd once viewed him with suspicion began warming up. A few apologized for believing Karen's lies. One afternoon, an elderly woman from down the street came by with a plate of freshly baked cookies. She looked both sheepish and relieved. Thank you, she said quietly, for standing up to her. We should have done it a long time ago. Andrew offered her a small, understanding smile. Glad I could help. He settled onto his porch that evening, sipping coffee as the sun dipped low in the sky. In that golden light, the street felt peaceful, almost serene, the very thing he'd sought when he first moved here. The last week had been anything but restful, yet he felt a sense of vindication. He gazed down at the plate of cookies, thinking about how fear could warp a community, and how courage, sometimes just a single act, could snap people out of it. The cookies tasted like forgiveness, but Andrew kept his badge visible on the porch table. Old habits die hard, and in this neighborhood, so did grudges. Still, there was one comforting certainty. Karen Mitchell wasn't coming back.